BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays, I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And in this episode, I will be looking at the book Jack the Ripper Double Cross, responding to your questions and comments about Charles Lechmere as a Jack the Ripper suspect, and discussing the Victorian serial killers video from ASMR Historian. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. Last week on the channel, I did a response to the videos from Jack the Ripper tour, and one of them was an interview with Ian Hope, who was promoting his new book, Jack the Ripper Double Cross. And I have to give credit and thanks to Ian Hope for checking out Black Box Online Radio and listening to my episode, and you guys also provided a lot of very insightful comments in the section down below. And if you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts under the names Black Box Podcast or Black Box True Crime, feel free to join the YouTube comments section if you have something to say about Charles Lechmere as a Jack the Ripper suspect. But I thought that this could be a very good opportunity to respond to some of your questions and comments, and also to really just ask ourselves the question, is Charles Lechmere a defendable Jack the Ripper suspect? Because there are people out there who are convinced that Charles Lechmere was indeed Jack the Ripper, or he's not just some far-out wacky individual who has been incorporated into some equally far-out wacky theory. There is a chance that Charles Lechmere was indeed the Whitechapel murderer. So let's go through some of the information right now, and once again, Ian Hope is the author of the book Jack the Ripper Double Cross, and I would actually like to look at something that he has written out before I get to your questions and comments. And this is just from the free introduction that he has posted on Amazon from his book Jack the Ripper Double Cross. On the 31st of August, 1888, according to his testimony, carman Charles Allen Cross left his home at 3:30 a.m., it says about 3:30 a.m., to walk to work at Pickford's on Broad Street. His route took him along a quiet, echoing street known as Buck's Row, a street encased on the north side with Brown and Eagle Wool Warehouse on the south side with a terraced housing. Today the street is called Durwood Street, a narrow street with residences on the south side. As he approached Brown's yard on the north side of the street, he noticed that there was a tarpaulin on the opposite side of the road, near the gateway to Brown's yard. At first he was not quite so sure, so he crossed to the middle of the road for a better look, and realized that it was a woman lying there. At this point he heard another man approaching, approximately 40 yards away, approaching from the direction he had come from. He had turned back to the north pavement and tried to address him. This man, Robert Paul, tried to avoid Cross, as he was very wary of people being attacked in the area, and tried to give a wide berth. Cross tapped him on the shoulder and exclaimed, "Come and look over here, there is a woman lying on the pavement." Cross thought the woman was dead. Robert Paul, after touching her chest, thought that maybe she was still alive, as he thought that there was a slight breath. Charles Cross suggested, according to his account at the inquest, that they should prop her up, but Robert Paul refused. Neither man could see any obvious injury to the woman, as it was very dark, so they left the scene to find and alert a policeman and tell him of their discovery. They found P.C. Misen at the end of Hanbury Street in Baker's Row, and told him that there was a woman lying in Buck's Row whom was either dead or drunk. After relating their concerns to P.C. Misen, both Paul and Cross continued along Hanbury Street, ironically the scene of the next Jack the Ripper murder. And that is one thing that really, really has definitely stood out to me, because, of course, the site Hanbury Street would be the location of the murder of Annie Chapman, and just as Ian Hope said there, the next Jack the Ripper murder, which would only occur about, oh goodness, just over a week later. So, is there some type of mental pattern that is laid out? To the proponents of the Charles Lechmere theory, perhaps Absolutely, almost certainly, if that's what this guy is doing in his own calculated and sociopathic way, is he not setting these events up like a set of markers or committing this in just one giant deception ruse? Perhaps they would be believers of that. But I think that this is a very good starting point, because one thing that Ian Hope wanted to challenge me on actually was the time in which Charles Lechmere left, and I estimated at 3:15, but as you just heard from his book there, it would be 3:30, and this is a comment from Ian Hope using his handle, Jack the Ripper Double Cross. Hi, thanks for the video. I'm only a part way in, but already the errors are staggering. There is no evidence Cross left home at 3:15 a.m. Most reports go with about 3:30 a.m. Unfortunately, if you start from the incorrect starting point, you're going to arrive at the incorrect result. Thanks again for the video. And I mean, I do appreciate that from Ian Hope, that he chose to listen to my episode and respond, and I can always accept a correction, but I do want to reinforce something. All of these times are approximate. That's one. And one more thing is, we still have the intervals and the time that would not be accounted for. And just going off of my own personal experiences from reading, different estimations, the smallest estimation that I have heard is 8 minutes, and the largest one is 13 to 15 minutes. That's why I was very, very wavering about the times during the last episode, and that there could have been 8 minutes in which Charles Lechmere was with Polly Nichols that were not accounted for. Well, then what on earth was happening? Now, this book, Jack the Ripper Double Cross, unlike many other Jack the Ripper books, is not going to be one that is going to try and vilify the suspect. Instead, Ian Hope is actually making the case that Charles Lechmere was not Jack the Ripper. Now, one thing that I thought of, and a lot of you probably will not like this, and you might even be surprised to hear this from me, as somebody who said that even though Charles Lechmere is not my suspect, I did put him in the upper echelon of suspects, a suspect worthy of serious consideration, and maybe he actually was Jack the Ripper. I have about 5 of those. But I was thinking, 8 minutes. What on earth could this guy be doing for 8 minutes? What if it's exactly what everybody said it was? That he saw a tarp in the streets, and then he's first thinking about what to do with it. He walks over, he sees that it's actually a woman, then he walks back and forth. Is it possible that he spent 8 minutes just simply evaluating and assessing the scene and pondering what to do next? I think that would be a little bit excessive in the amount of time, and all of these events could have taken place within 1 minute or 2 minutes, but 8 to 15 minutes? I mean, people do things like that. People can linger at a crime scene. Could that not account for this type of discrepancy where people think this is going to blow the case wide open? That Lechmere is alone with Polly Nichols. He had 8 to 15 minutes to commit the murder, as well as to get his story straight and to jump into character. Could it just be that he was doing exactly what everybody thought he was doing for 100 years? That he saw a tarp in the street, so he decided to assess the scene? But there is another thing that I would like to follow up with from last week's episode, and it's the entire question of, why is this theory so popular? Why has this theory gained so much traction? And of course, there is the House of Lechmere video series. There is the book Cutting Point that was put out by Krister Holmgren. But I think that this is one that has gained a lot of traction because, to the credit of Edward Stowe, he actually shows you how people have misinterpreted the narrative and how people evolved with the narrative and assumed that Charles Lechmere was not doing anything wrong. First, it's Lechmere saw a tarpaulin in the street. Then he decided that he wanted to salvage the tarpaulin. Then they're writing that Charles Lechmere was walking around the scene listening for noises. And he's like, no, writers have added in these details because they assumed that he wasn't doing anything wrong. And now, the thing that I've just said as a precursor is, what if those are indeed assumptions? But what if they are valid assumptions? What if that's actually what Charles Lechmere was doing? He was trying to salvage the tarpaulin, realized it's a woman's body, so he walked up and down and listened for noises. Does that not account for the 8 minutes that have been excluded from a lot of timelines? Now, in the book Jack the Ripper Double Cross, this The reasons why this theory has become popular are discussed by Ian Hope, and I would like to look at his words here. In the summer of 2000, Derek Osborne published a piece in Ripperana number 33 entitled The Man Who Was Jack the Ripper. This article explored the possibility of Charles Cross being the man responsible for the Whitechapel murders. The following year, another article appeared in number 36, Watchman, Old Man, I Believe Somebody is Murdered Down by the Street, by John Carey, suggesting his involvement. Furthermore, in the following edition in July of 2001, Osborne suggested the man gave his name at the inquest as Charles Cross was actually Charles Allen Lechmere. Cross's possible guilt was addressed by John Carey in 2002 and by Osborne in 2007, and by Michael Connor in 4 issues of The Ripperologist between 2006 and 2008, including articles called Did the Ripper Work for Pickford's and Lechmere, the Man in Bucks Row? The Lechmere theory gathered some more momentum when Swedish journalist Christer Holmgren and Edward Stowe had a report published in the Daily Telegraph on August 31st of 2012, the 124th anniversary of poor Polly's death. Christer Holmgren also posted an article in the Swedish newspaper Sydsvenskan, excuse me if I mispronounced that, on December 29th of 2012. Holmgren and criminologist Gareth Norris also explored the case against him in the 2014 Channel 5 documentary Jack the Ripper, The Missing Evidence. And that might be the most famous one, and if you're a follower of the Ripper case, perhaps you have seen Jack the Ripper, The Missing Evidence, and you've also perhaps are familiar with that piece of media. But I wanted to use this as a Q&A session where I would respond to some more of your questions and comments and from last week's episode. So let's go over and look at some other things that have been shared, and there will be many more that have come from Ian Hope. One of them is from Thomas Van Helden, who says, Ian Hope hasn't done his due diligence. He doesn't have the slightest clue of what the Lechmere theory entails. He merely counters nonsense Reddit arguments. And I'm not necessarily sure that that's going to be true. I think that he wrote a book-length response about why he does not believe that this person was Jack the Ripper, and he is ultimately going to be challenging a theory that is widely discussed, and I think everybody has the right to do that. And I would also expect that if somebody has written this book-length response that they are familiar with the Lechmere theory, so credit to Ian Hope. Now, the next comment comes to us from Dave Smith, and there are going to be several of these. And this one is directed toward me, actually, where it says, again, you misunderstand the point. Perhaps it's not worded properly. And this point is that Charles Lechmere was the only suspect who was found alone at the crime scene, or he's the only suspect with a connection to the Jack the Ripper crime scene. And let's have a read here. Lechmere is the only suspect found with the victim alone, and as of the date, with no alibi for his previous whereabouts. Additionally, this victim will display characteristic anomalies in comparison to other victims, namely the wounds were hidden, the body not posed, and the mutilations were unfinished. On the other hand, the killer's trademark was there, death via strangulation and knife, out in the open and absolute silence. And I do appreciate that from Dave Smith, and I also want to be very clear about something. Last week on the channel, I was talking about how there was this statement made that Charles Lechmere is the only Jack the Ripper suspect who has a connection to the crime scene. I heard that on Jack the Ripper Tour, but they were not citing the work of Edward Stowe or Christer Holmgren or any of the previous individuals who wrote for Ripperologist magazine. They were citing people just in the comments section. They were reading off comments that had been left on Jack the Ripper Tour videos, and they're just using those as examples. My responses were directed at them, because there are people out there saying that Charles Lechmere is the only suspect who has a connection to the crime scene, and I brought up 5 other suspects who have connections to the crime scenes, but the actual conditions that are being discussed is that Charles Lechmere is the only suspect found with the victim alone and with no alibi for his previous whereabouts. In all of the suspects that I brought up, including Robert Paul himself, whom I don't think he was Jack the Ripper, I don't think he's a defendable suspect, but he has been accused. Robert Paul, Isaac Kosabrowski, Samuel Friedman, and George Hutchinson. So with all of these individuals, they have they have explanations about what they were doing previously, especially Isaac Kosabrowski and Samuel Friedman, who were at Burner Street, and they were in the International Men's Working Education Club, and they were witnessed there by many people, and they go on to become witnesses who saw the body of Liz Stride, or Samuel Friedman is someone who was in the building. So people know about their whereabouts, and what they were doing all of the time has been accounted for. And with George Hutchinson, he provided an explanation when he saw Mary Kelly on the night shortly before she was murdered. I'll just leave it at that. And I also want to look at some other comments that were done in response. And this comes to us from Ian Hope, and this is a great thing for a Q&A session. Can you show me in any sworn under oath statement that Charles Cross was alone for some period of time with Polly Nichols? I'm betting you £1,000 you can't, because there is none. Well, I mean, I am totally open to accepting that. I am perhaps the first person to admit that it is undocumented, and that's why it's part of this mystery, and that's why there's so much intrigue around Charles Lechmere as a Jack the Ripper suspect, because people simply do not know what could be going on in these 8 to 13 minutes or 8 to 15 minutes. And was he committing the murder of Polly Nichols, or was he just looking at her body and then walking up and down, listening for noises, thinking about what to do? Should I alert someone? Should I tell someone? I do think that 8 minutes would be a very long time to linger at a crime scene, but I also do not think that that's beyond belief. And I want to share something with you guys. I want to share something that somebody told me offline after I did my Charles Lechmere video last week, and that was that they were saying that if Charles Lechmere were Jack the Ripper, then most likely he would have inserted himself into one of the crime scenes. He would have lingered at the crime scene and made up this fake cover story about just snapping into character and pretending to be a witness, because it would make it look less obvious. It's hiding in plain sight, and it's also just providing an explanation about why he was there, but also he's going to take suspicion away from himself, because people would be thinking, there's no way that this guy was the serial killer that we're looking for. I mean, he openly talked to a police officer that night. He openly flagged somebody down. There's no way the killer would do that. The killer would just run away. It's almost thinking in reverse. Everybody would be expecting him to just simply run away. But the fact that he's actually talking to people after the murder of Polly Nichols, people like Robert Paul and P.C. Misen, does that not suggest that, he could be putting on a giant ruse? And again, I think that we really have to just accept that if Charles Lechmere were Jack the Ripper, he would have to have been perhaps the most sociopathic liar in the history of the world. And I do say that a lot here on Black Box Online Radio, but I'm really just not convinced that there's really anything to the contrary, because that's what's happening with Charles Lechmere. This isn't some guy who's just experiencing some type of fit of mania, and he's losing control of his mental faculties, and he's just roaming around, and he's just kind of a stumbling and bumbling mess, and he starts, making noises around women, grunting and huffing and puffing, and a woman walks over and says, "Oh, well, you look like you need a good time, come with me." No, with Charles Lechmere, then this would be quite to the contrary. This seems like someone who would have been a very, very intense sociopathic liar and set this whole thing up. So what do you think? Do you think that Charles Lechmere was a very, very intense sociopath or psychopath, and that he set all of this up as a giant web of lies and manipulation? Or do you think that he was just some guy walking to work, he saw the body of Polly Nichols, he panicked for a second, he hesitated for a second, he stood around and thought about what to do, and then ultimately he flagged down Robert Paul. Innocent or guilty? Which one are you leaning toward? And this will tie in very nicely to the next comment from Dave Smith, which says, "It is a well-known fact that pathological lying and manipulation are tied to psychopaths. Jack the Ripper showed psychopathic traits. Now we can't prove it, hence it's a theory." And the response from Ian Hope was, "Are you a trained psychologist? Because in my book, I quote various people who are, and they all claim that not all killers are psychopaths. Even if killers are psychopaths, Charles Cross did not display any of these behaviors. And yes, I am qualified to make those assessments. Thank you very much. Okay, I want to be very clear about something. I know it sounds like maybe I've been saying some pro-Lechmere things in this episode, but I want to be very, very clear about something. Not all murderers are psychopaths. Not all murderers are sociopaths. You can have different personality traits. I mean, as a prime example, not all serial killers are psychopaths, because John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, was not even labeled as a clinical psychopath. To be a clinical psychopath, you have to get a score of 30 out of 40 or higher on the Hare checklist. John Wayne Gacy scored a 27, although the United States and the United Kingdom have different standards. In the United Kingdom, it's 25 points out of 40, and the 27 score would mean that by the UK standards, he was a psychopath. But that's just, an example. This stuff is very malleable, it's very flexible, and also it reinforces the point that Ian Hope is making, that not all killers are psychopaths, not all serial killers are psychopaths. With Jack the Ripper, I tend to lean toward the fact that Jack the Ripper was most likely a psychopath or a sociopath, and I'm not trying to go all over the map, I'm not trying to be weird and confusing, I'm genuinely laying out the facts. Fact number one is that not all killers are psychopaths. You don't have to be a psychopath to be a killer. For example, lots of killers are narcissists, but they are not psychopathic. And secondarily, though, the way that Jack the Ripper handled the victims does show psychopathic signatures. For example, even if you read Paul Rowland's book, Killer Psychopaths, he talks about this very clearly, that a killer who attacks the victims and discards their bodies and leaves them where they are without any attempt to conceal what he has done is most likely what? A psychopath, because he is showing absolute indifference to the victims, to their humanity, and he is just treating them like objects. And that's exactly what Jack the Ripper did. He murdered women in the streets, with the exception of Mary Kelly, mutilated them, cut out their organs, and then maybe he wrote letters bragging about it. So I think that Jack the Ripper was a psychopath, and I'm not saying this purely because of Paul Rowland's book. I'm saying it because of, well, the other thousands of books that have been written saying very similar subjects. But what do you think? Do you think that Jack the Ripper was a psychopath? Do you think that he was mentally ill in a different way? Do you think that Jack the Ripper was somebody who was just trying to do this for a different reason? And the example that I always come back to in terms of counterbalance is with Chaim Hyams, who is somebody who had epilepsy, and in that theory, which is mostly put forward by Sarah Bax Horton in her book One Arm Jack, is that Chaim Hyams would have experienced epilepsy, he would have had fits of mania as a result from epileptic seizures that would have affected his impulses, his judgments, and so on, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he was a psychopath or a sociopath. That's a different type of mental health issue, and I don't know if Chaim Hyams was a psychopath or sociopath or not. Maybe that stuff wasn't even evaluated when he was back in the asylum in the 1800s. So what do you think? Which side are you going with? And do you think that there is a different reason for Jack the Ripper's mania? And over time, I've really had somewhat of a reversal about this. I was really thinking for a long time that the Ripper's murders were the result of something like schizophrenia, schizotypal personality disorder, or some type of psychotic episode where somebody was experiencing a very strong deteriorating mental state. But with the Charles Lechmere claims, none of that is present. This is all about somebody who was calculating, who knew what he was doing. It's exactly what that other commenter was talking about, the person who had spoken to me and said that they thought that he would have tried to hide in plain sight because he wouldn't have expected the authorities to think about him in that way. This is a calculating sociopath, as opposed to somebody who was just experiencing some bizarre mental health issue. Our next comment comes to us from Mark Trotman, who says, "Such a weak suspect, up there with Barnett, Deem Schutz, and Pizer, but only slightly better than Lewis Carroll. 10 years from now he'll vanish from most people's lists of favorites, and anyone who seriously researches the case will not ever consider him. House of Lechmere is an excellent channel, but the suspect is utterly implausible, with nothing of substance indicating that he may be viable." Wow, that is a very, very big takedown. No, I absolutely think that Charles Lechmere is a stronger suspect than Louis Deemschutz or John Pizer. If anything, I don't even know if I view John Pizer as a real suspect at all anymore. Now, reportedly, he had an ironclad alibi. This is John Pizer, the man thought of as Leather Apron. With Louis Deemschutz, again, he is a suspect who has a connection to the crime scene, Burner Street, but he's the one who's driving his horse and cart down to the International Men's Working Education Club, and he is someone who would have had his whereabouts accounted for because, as I understand, he was returning from work, so, they know where he was beforehand, they know what he was doing, he's taking his horse and cart down the street, and yes, he is a Jack the Ripper suspect, and that is discussed in the book Sherlock Holmes in the Autumn of Terror by Randy Williams. But at the same time, that is a big difference with Charles Lechmere, where there is this very large discrepancy in the time, and we don't necessarily know what Lechmere was doing before the murder of Polly Nichols. But we have a comment and rebuttal to the one that was put up by Mark Trotman, and this is from Tony Smith, who says, "How is he the weakest suspect? He was at the scene of the first murder, canonical anyway, lied to the police, had the opportunity to do the others, as well as the motive. Kosminski and Druitt were nowhere near the crime scenes, according to the lack of evidence. These top suspects were scribblings of one man's marginalia." That would be referring to the McNaughton Memorandum, written by Melville McNaughton. Kosminski was a suspect because he was bonkers, and Druitt because he offed himself after Mary Kelly. In those days, even just being gay could have been down as being deviant. Now let's respond to some of these things here because we have lots of suspects that are being discussed. I completely agree. Kosminski, referring to Aaron Kosminski, and Montague John Druitt do not have connections to the crime scenes. Immediately, I cannot name a single person who has put forward a statement saying, "Oh yes, I saw a man at the crime scene, and his name was Aaron Kosminski. He was a Polish native who came to England when he was 16, or anybody even placing Montague John Druitt at the crime scene. Absolutely, Kosminski is somebody who gets accused because of his bizarre behavior, mental health issues, and also perhaps suspicious nature in general. Montague John Druitt gets accused of this because of his suspicious suicide that took place after the murder of Mary Kelly, even though it's 3 weeks after the murder of Mary Kelly. She dies on November 9th, and Montague John Druitt perhaps would have committed suicide around the end of November, early December of 1888. But, believe it or not, I think that Kosminski is a strong suspect. I think that Montague John Druitt is one of the weakest Jack the Ripper suspects that I've ever encountered, and I have 2 episodes about him. I also have an episode about Kosminski, more than one actually. But in terms of behaviors, I totally admit it. Even though I put Kosminski in the upper echelon of suspects as well, I'm the first to admit that I can't place him at a crime scene. That definitely hasn't stopped people from looking at Kosminski, and I don't think that it's going to. Another point that I disagree with is, I don't think that these theories involving Charles Lechmere are going to disappear in 10 years. Now this theory, as you heard from Ian Hope's introduction, in his book, Jack the Ripper Double Cross, states very clearly that this is something that's been going around for more than 20 years. And it's not like Charles Lechmere has been debunked. And if anything, I think that the proponents of the Lechmere theory are going to be even louder over the next 10 years. Some people are just going to simply accept that the Jack the Ripper case has been solved, and it was Charles Lechmere. One suspect that I don't think that is ever going to fade from the public discussion sphere is Aaron Kosminski. And suspects like Montague John Druitt, John Pizer, Louis Deemschutz are all going to probably, if not fade away completely, they will just have their place in the history of Jack the Ripper for being witnesses, for being wrongly accused, and for being people who are incorporated in the story. I don't think that people are going to forget about them because John Pizer is the man behind the famous Leather Apron story. Montague John Druitt is viewed as either the prime suspect in some people's eyes or the fall guy suspect in some people's eyes. For me, Montague John Druitt is an absolute fall guy. He was a man who was wrongfully accused. I don't think he had anything to do with this. I'm not convinced that Montague John Druitt had any anything to do with murder. I don't think he murdered anyone. And if anything, I think that Montague John Druitt is someone who was unfairly vilified by the history books, and he gets accused of being the worst serial killer in the history of the world. But in all reality, I think that he's more likely to be just someone who had some issues with depression and his own internal struggles as opposed to external struggles. Some guy's found dead in the Thames, he committed suicide. That does not mean that he was Jack the Ripper. And of course, Aaron Kosminski is going to rest as perhaps the prime suspect. Joseph Barnett was another person on that list, and I haven't really talked too much about him in this episode. And ultimately, even though I thought he was a strong suspect in the past, I had to admit he was the ex-lover of Mary Kelly. The only thing that he seems to have in terms of a connection to this case is his connection to Mary Kelly. And I really had to take Joseph Barnett out of the top tier of suspects because I had to admit that I don't know of any other reason to suspect him other than it's just blame the ex-boyfriend. Maybe there are reasons to look at him for that murder, but not the other murders. What do you think about any of those comments made in regards to the suspects? And I told you guys that in this episode I would also be discussing the video on Victorian serial killers from ASMR Historian. I put out a polling question on Black Box Online Radio recently, and I was asking you guys, do you ever listen to true crime ASMR, like videos that help you fall asleep? And most of you said yes, but there was an option that I included there, and that is that I don't use them to fall asleep, I use them for content, and that's where I am. I really do not listen to true crime channels when I'm trying to fall asleep at night. I do it because I want to hear what they have to say. And ASMR Historian did a video on Victorian serial killers, and they were trying to avoid the Jack the Ripper content and focus on other lesser-known serial killers. But when you're talking about Victorian true crime, it is almost impossible to do that without mentioning Jack the Ripper. And two of the Jack the Ripper suspects that were discussed in this video were James Maybrick and Thomas Neill Cream. Now, as far as James Maybrick goes, they actually discussed his wife, Florence Maybrick, who was convicted of murdering James Maybrick by arsenic poisoning. And I thought, this is so weird to include in a discussion on Victorian serial killers because, personally, I'm not even convinced that Florence Maybrick had anything to do with James Maybrick's murder. He may have overdosed himself on arsenic. Secondarily, she wasn't a serial killer. She was only convicted of one murder. Okay, but I digress from that. I found the discussions on Thomas Neill Cream were so much more fascinating because Thomas Neill Cream was a real serial killer known as the Lambeth Poisoner. I have 2 episodes about him. Feel free to check out my Jack the Ripper Suspects playlist if you want to hear more. And Thomas Neill Cream is somebody who just had a lot of very, very big red flags. I mean, for starters, he's convicted of murder in 1881, the murder of Daniel Stott, and then he makes it to England at some time between 1887 and 1891. Let's just leave it at that. And he was reported to have had very intense oral fixations. He was either chewing something, sucking on something, putting something in his mouth. Like, he really had this very bizarre oral fixation, and I would cite the book, The Case of the Murderous Dr. Cream. And then I would also like to point out that in this ASMR Historian video, they were very keen to note that Dr. Thomas Neill Cream was somebody who was trained in medicine, but it seems like he just had these natural proclivities and natural inclinations to commit crimes. Was he born and programmed to kill, or was he somebody who developed these tendencies as a sociopath? It's somewhat in the middle, but it's almost as if he had the opportunity to be a real medical doctor, but he turned that down because he wanted to do a life of crime. And all of the things that they're talking about with Dr. Thomas Neill Cream relate to criminal behaviors. Once he's out of prison, for the murder of Daniel Stott, mind you, he's still involved with scandals, blackmail, cheating, lying, deception, getting involved with other just deviant forms of behavior and just showing absolute indifference. And ASMR Historian was proposing that perhaps Dr. Thomas Neill Cream was a psychopathic narcissist, and I think that is a perfect way of categorizing him. A psychopathic narcissist, because he is somebody who may have actually been targeting his victims during the Lambeth poisoning murders because of blackmail. It's possible that he was going after his targets because of some type of previous arrangement, some arrangement that went wrong, and he specifically chose to poison them because they were not doing what he wanted. This is all about deviant behavior. This is all about sociopathic lying, psychopathic narcissism. This is somebody who is committing these crimes because he's not getting what he wants, and he's just obsessed with his own sensation seeking, obsessed with his own pleasure seeking. He is just obsessed with his own benefit and showing absolutely no regard for anybody else. Now, with a suspect like Charles Lechmere, I have no idea if those tendencies are actually present. I mean, Charles Lechmere may have been somebody who's going to fall into the Montague John Druitt category, where I just said that they are somebody who is unfairly vilified in history. But with somebody such as Charles Lechmere, the man of this week's episode, I think that there are reasons why people suspect him, and there is evidence. Maybe not proof, but there is evidence. I would absolutely rank Charles Lechmere as a higher suspect and a more viable suspect than Thomas Neill Cream, than Montague John Druitt, than Louis Diemschutz, Isaac Ozabrowski, and Samuel Friedman, and even Joseph Barnett, whom I just mentioned, because there's a chance that Charles Lechmere was Jack the Ripper. Dr. Thomas Neill Cream almost certainly not. An ASMR historian even brought it up. According to the official narrative, he was incarcerated in the United States of America in the state of Illinois from 1881 to 1891 for the previously mentioned murder of Daniel Stott. And anything to the contrary is just a giant conspiracy theory. But what do you think about Charles Lechmere? Do you think that he was Jack the Ripper, or has he been unfairly vilified? Was he just a man walking to work and he found the body? This is, I think, the best challenge to the Lechmere theory, and that is that somebody has to find the body. Somebody does. Somebody has to encounter the person in the street. Now, all of the suspicious activities around Lechmere, his movements, his behaviors, do you think that that means that he was Jack the Ripper, or has he been unfairly vilified? I do put him in the top tier of suspects, and he hasn't budged. The other people in that sphere would be Charles Lechmere, Aaron Kosminski, Francis Thompson, I think, is a very strong suspect. George Hutchinson is also up there, and Jacob Levy. Those would be my top 5 suspects. Please share anything you want in the comments section down below. I would love to read them. And Black Box Online Radio comes to you Monday through Friday here on YouTube, of course on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, under the names Black Box True Crime or Black Box Podcast. And you can share anything you want in the comments section. This show was also available on Facebook and Instagram for shorts and reels. Those also come out on Monday through Friday, mostly talking about serial killers, true crime news, and anything under the sun or in the darkness. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. Every Monday is Zodiac Monday here on Black Box Online Radio, and every Thursday is Dahlia Thursday, where I talk about the Black Dahlia murder. So, I will see you tomorrow for an episode about the Black Dahlia, and until next time.